everyone. I hope you are well in these difficult times. My name is Raza Said, and I am Assistant Professor of Law at the University of Warwick, UK. Tommaso, who is um, a good friend and a former colleague, he asked me very kindly to contribute to your sessions and speak about the interplay between human rights and resistance, and also explore the positioning of human rights within the global justice paradigm. So, before perhaps we can answer that conclusively, there are a few things that we need to chart out. So, one is that when we talk about human rights and the human rights discourse as a wider framework, it's much bigger than human rights law. Now, even human rights law is an amalgamation of both what we find in the domestic jurisdictions and international human rights law. So, in the domestic jurisdictions, for instance, we have constitutional frameworks, we have bills of rights, we have charters of fundamental rights, we have fundamental rights guarantees, and so on and so forth, which quite a few people generally take as their interaction with the human rights debates and human rights guarantees and frameworks. But then we also have the international human rights law. So, for instance, we have the International Bill of Rights, which is uh, a combination of both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a non-binding instrument, and then the binding aspects, which are the binding on the obviously the parties that have signed and ratified these conventions. So we have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Together, they give us the International Bill of Rights, but we also have other instruments and conventions and covenants. So, for instance, we have the Convention Against Torture. We have Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, commonly known as CEDAW. We have Convention on the Rights of Child, the Refugee Convention, and so on and so forth. Even regional frameworks such as either the African Charter or the European Convention on Human Rights, they operate at a regional level but are part of what we would consider an international legal framework. Uh, but when we say, or when we talk about the human rights discourse, as I said, it includes these aspects, but it also includes the notions of human rights politics. Uh, how does the international community react to certain things? What does the international community hold dear? What are the powers of the United Nations? Uh, what are the restrictions on the powers of the United Nations? The Chapter 7 powers, for instance, that allow UN to take actions in certain cases, but also the veto power that's linked uh, to the UN Security Council, to the permanent five members, which also disbars action at certain times. The human rights framework or human rights discourse also talks about or also includes the theories or the philosophies of human rights, the ideas of natural rights and natural justice, the link between the individual and the social, the ideas of the political. All of these things have fed into how we consider fed into the development of the human rights framework as to how we understand it in the current day and age. So when we talk about human rights discourse on the whole, it's not just one thing. It's all of these things taken together, because theories and ideas feed into how legal frameworks have come about, and they feed into what we understand as our current discourse. So that's one thing. But then uh, I'd also like to alert you to a few contradictions or paradoxes that we find within the human rights uh, frameworks and human rights paradigm in current day and age. So, one is the contradiction or the paradox of, or what I consider the idea of the rights sovereignty paradox. So, sovereignty paradox goes in this way, that sovereign power or the state is generally considered to be the main guarantor or enforcer of rights. Within the international legal framework, it's the states that undertake the responsibility to ensure your rights. The states are the signatories to these rights. The states, either through their constitutions or uh, fundamental rights charters and guarantees, vow to ensure your rights. But then what happens if the states either are unable or unwilling to fulfill your rights? What if, in the extreme cases, the states become the violators of rights? So that's, for instance, what we found or what we saw in apartheid South Africa. The key thing to remember about the apartheid regime in South Africa was that, immoral and problematic as the discrimination was against the native population and the majority of the population, it was done through the exercise of law. The legal framework guaranteed or ensured the discrimination. So, in this case, for instance, what are the avenues available if the sovereign power, as I said, is unable or unwilling to take responsibility for your rights? So that's a contradiction. Sometimes we are able to find answer through the human rights framework, but then the politics of it comes into play as well. The other paradox comes into play when we look at the interplay between rights and duties. So what happens? So we say that, for instance, that rights have correlated duties. But what happens if there's nobody to either assume the duty to fulfill your rights or ensure your rights, or nobody, not even your state, assumes that responsibility? So that's the case that we find, for instance, with regards to refugees. And uh, that's something that, for instance, Hannah Arendt spoke about many decades ago when she talked about the right to have rights. So, according to her, the first fundamental right was the right to have rights. Now, what did she mean by that? The idea was that there has to be a political community around you to ensure or to undertake the responsibility to fulfilling your rights at the point and at the time when they are violated. That's when the rights or the guarantee of your rights or the protection of your rights is needed the most. So keep those two contradictions in mind when we talk about resistance. So just briefly, uh, moving on to the issue of the interplay between human rights and resistance. Now, we see human rights as a very useful and valuable tool within the debates on resistance. Human rights has taken on the mantle of being the legitimate and the dominant and the mainstream voice of resistance. We use human rights language to hold states to account. We use human rights language to bring perpetrators of gross violations to justice. We use the human rights framework to speak, in some cases, truth to power. So, human rights has been the dominant language of struggle in the current day and age. That's why there are quite a few third world scholars who argue that human rights have played a key role in, for instance, the ideas of self determination, but also in just bringing some sort of debates on equality and dignity to the forefront. But at the same time, with regards to resistance, there are other problems and contradictions. So, for instance, despite being the main language of resistance, there are certain resistances, there are certain struggles that are not able uh, to translate themselves within the human rights discourse, or the human rights language is unable to understand them. So, for instance, if a struggle is not geared towards the idea of property rights, but instead it claims that we belong to this land as our ancestors did, right? That's, for instance, one of the ideas that we find uh, in indigenous land struggles. It's not always easy for the human rights idea to understand it, because the idea of belonging to land is not taken as a mainstream right. Holding property, or your economic right to benefit from the property, is one thing, but belonging to land, that's quite a different struggle. So that's one avenue where there's gap between the dominant notions of human rights and some of the resistance struggles that we see around us. But also, more problematically, there are certain issues and problems that are just not the human rights discourse is not able to have an answer for. So, for instance, as we are here in this localized global lockdown, asking for the states to either provide us some sort of healthcare. Uh, Sorry, I just lost my trail of thought there. So, as we are here in this localized global lockdown, trying to deal with this pandemic, asking the states to take responsibility and provide us the solutions and provide us adequate health care. There are states that are willing to do it. There are states that are able to take responsibility. So, whether there's a solution to this or not, that's a different question. But then there are states that are using the old card of resource availability. Now, why I say this, an old card, is because when we look at the history of economic, social, and cultural right, there's a phrase there, the idea that economic, social, and cultural rights have to be fulfilled or should be fulfilled progressively. So there's a progressive realization of rights to the maximum available resources. Now, it was never meant for the states to use as a get out of jail free card, but that's what some states do. They say that we don't have the resources to provide healthcare. At the same time, there are states that are unwilling to take the responsibility for these rights. So, for instance, they say that our responsibility is to provide you with adequate livelihood, and then it's your responsibility to buy insurance and access healthcare. Now, all of these things go back to the two contradictions that I was talking about and the issue of politics and theories and so on and so forth. What happens if the state is either unwilling or unable to assume responsibility to fulfill your rights? What if the state, for instance, in this case, is not willing to give you the health care that you need or deserve? And by this, it's not that the state becomes the main violator of rights, but it does not assume the responsibility. So, can we say that your rights exist at that point in time? And also, what avenues do you have is if the state in question, the state that you are part of, is not able to grant you rights? Uh, do we have an answer to that? Now, these questions are hard questions, and so far, the human rights discourse on the whole is unable to provide a conclusive answer and a judgment on these. So, in terms, just to sort of wrap it up quite briefly, the issue or the interplay between human rights and resistance is a paradoxical one, where human rights has become the dominant language of resistance, but in some cases, it is either not able to understand the issues of resistance or it is unable to provide the language in which the resistance can be couched. And so, if we are looking at it from the perspective of global justice or the wider paradigm of social justice or equality or non-discrimination and dignity of individuals, we have to take human rights as one path leading towards it, but it's not the entire story. And if we are unable to find an answer through human rights, legal frameworks, or human rights on the whole, then we have to explore other avenues to increase and create and provide global justice and social justice. Thank you, and all the best with your sessions.